Plain Truth, a show where we try to get into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining me this week, we have Courtney Brown, who works at the Farsight organization, and he and his team have created a very interesting video called Remote Viewing 9/11. Courtney, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I want to thank everyone and Paul for inviting me on your show.
Well, thank you for coming. We do appreciate it. And by the way, this is a very interesting video that your team has put together. And along for the ride this week, we have a couple of my friends. Melody, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good to see you, Courtney.
Great, Melody.
And Jerry.
I'm here, and welcome back, Courtney.
Welcome. Thank you.
Well, let's get to the heart of the matter. Courtney, you and your organization are one of the few places that have really been consistently putting out great stuff for years in the remote viewing world, and you've done it again. This video on 9/11 is really quite impressive, so I'd like to thank you for that. And why don't we just get into how you put it together, what's been going on, how have things been?
Sure. Well, this is a project on the 9/11 terrorist events of 2001, September 11, 2001, and it was a project that I always had in the back of my mind that I knew we'd eventually do. The trouble is, here at the Institute, and again, which is for those of you in the audience who don't know where we're coming from, we're at www.farsight.org. That's F-A-R-S-I-G-H-T, like seeing far.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit. We have been doing a tremendous number of studies. We're the only major venue in the entire planet where these major studies using military or military-derived methodologies for remote viewing, which is a mental process for transferring information across time and space, developed by the U.S. military. We're the only major venue where these major projects exist. And so we've been putting project after project out for a long while. But all throughout all of this time, with all of our studies dealing with the science of the nature of reality, the nature of time, and then we did a project on the Atlantis Project and the origin of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and then now 9/11 and a whole bunch of other ones. Well, I had in the back of my mind that we'd eventually do the 9/11 thing, but these remote viewers that we work with are the best on the planet. They're absolutely the best remote viewers on the planet. And if I was just to give them targets related to the 9/11 thing, the first thing they'd see is the Twin Towers coming down. They just conclude that that was it. So remote viewing works only if the remote viewer is blind to the target, meaning not knowing what the target is. Now, it's easy to give them the first target and have them do that blind, but if they're that good, they're going to see the towers come down and they're going to make conclusions, and then from then on, they're not going to be really guessing. So the project started actually years ago because I said, how am I going to keep these viewers doubting, guessing? Because if their conscious mind comes into it and sort of concludes that it's the 9/11 stuff, then everything they've seen on TV, the conspiracy theory stuff, everything will just sort of flood in, and the remote viewing perceptions, which are outside of the normal five physical senses, they would be swamped, and we'd get imagination and everything. So the key was to keep everybody in a total state of blank, so doubt. So when they got the first instructions, it was just, okay, we're starting a non-leading email saying we are starting a new project. There are 7 targets. Start with the first one. Send me a session. End of story. Nothing more. That was easy to do. The question is, what happens after that session comes in? So for years, and Paul, I may ask you, for years on the radio especially, because I wanted it to be public so that the remote viewers would believe it. Whenever they asked me about 9/11 or anything like that, or whenever I was asked about whether we'd ever do 9/11, I swore and came up with variously different reasons why we would never do that. I said things like, oh no, we have the military guys on our board of directors. There's no way in the world we're going to do that. There's so many flaky things going on with that 9/11. I know we're not supposed to touch that. The intel people don't want us to touch that. And I went on, different reasons, different times. And I'm very truthful in my interviews, but I can't be truthful when someone asks me what's the next project, because if the remote viewers have the slightest hint that that might be a project, I can't ever do it. The project won't work. So that's the one thing I can never, ever let out, what's our next project or even a possible future project. So on radio, and I'm going to ask if, I don't know if you guys remember, but when you guys were interviewing me the last couple of times, I'm sure somebody asked me about what's next, and what about 9/11? I probably came up with some crazy reason for, oh no, I'll never do that. Well, that was a plan. I had to keep doing that so that the remote viewers hearing it on the radio would then say, I guess he's telling the truth. We'll never do it. He said it on the radio. And I can only do that once, meaning we can only do this project once, meaning I can't do it again. Now, this time I'm not cheating you. We really can't do it again. Now that they know that any target's game, you know, if I sent them to a target and they started seeing the Twin Towers come down, it just won't work. So at this point, what we have with this project, it's huge, but I can't get you more. If you want more, you need to wait till somebody else, some other group gears up and does that stuff. So what we have here is, you know, we've answered 80, 90% of the questions anyone ever wanted to know about the 9/11 events, but we can't get you more. I mean, it's just physically impossible because the cat's out of the bag in terms of doing this. And see, the thing is, it's the nature of the project. The target is too big. You see it too easily. It's too easy to recognize. So that's why I can't like slide in something. So what we have is, fortunately, so I knew that when I did this project, I'd have to get every answer I can possibly squeeze out of these guys this time, because we won't have a next time. So the result was we had remote viewing sessions come in for all 7 targets, and we really isolated everything. Now, there is another change with this project. Historically, the military remote viewing methodologies have always focused on the use of paper and pen. And we have a mission at the Farsight Institute to change the world. And
that's all?
Yeah, no, but we want really people to understand that we're not physical beings only, and that we're fundamentally non-physical in ourselves, and evidence of this is the ability to remote view, and you know, transferring information in complete violation of the commonly accepted paradigms of physics, both quantum mechanics and relativistic physics, and which are, by the way, those paradigms are 100 plus years old, so they're in need of serious revision. So when you go to the university and take a course in physics and they tell you this is the bottom line, well, there's been refinements over the last 100 years. We can do quantum computing now. The mathematics is more refined and everything, but the fundamentals haven't changed for 100 plus years. That should tell you right away they're screwed up. So we're entering a phase where the need for a complete new realm of physics is going to be needed too. The only way they can defend the current paradigms of quantum mechanics and relativistic physics, which are not wrong, they're correct, but they're limited within a sandbox. Go outside the sandbox, they don't relate. So the only way they can keep defending those as the last word is by disallowing all evidence or all data, all experimental evidence that shows that things are not limited that way. So, you know, you can prove anything as long as you don't look at any data that disprove it. Anyway, so that's what they're in right now. But anyway, so we have this project, the 9/11 project, that it was a big change for us in one way, because it started with Dick Algar. We've been doing these. Dick Algar is one of our great remote viewers, and he was a celebrity newscaster for 30 years. And he was more comfortable in front of a camera than off camera. And so when he was doing these remote viewing sessions, it was natural for him to say, well, why don't I do this standing up in front of a whiteboard? So he started to try it, and he did one session for our Atlantis project. And I was really quite resistant to this in the beginning. And that's true of a lot of stupid things that I do. And he sent it in, and I looked at it, and I said, wow, that's really great. Rather than write it on a paper and pen, he did it on video, and he sent it to me on a whiteboard. He did it on a whiteboard, recorded, and I said, that's great. So we included it in our Atlantis DVD. I liked it so much, I said, well, let's do our next project 50-50, 50% paper and pen, and then 50% video. And so Daz Smith was going to be our next, or was going to be our other viewer on the Great Pyramid of Giza project. He had a new camera, and we decided, let's just go for it. So 50% of the remote viewing for the Great Pyramid of Giza was done with paper and pen, and 50% for both viewers was done with video. And it turned out so interesting, so great. So when we got to this one, we decided, well, let's just go for it, because the paper and pen stuff is really something you can only look at if you're into remote viewing. Like if you're an aficionado of remote viewing, if you're really into the details and the methodologies, you like looking at these sessions on paper and pen. But it's totally unpersuasive to the masses, to the public. They want to see things on YouTube. They want to see things on video. They want it on the screen. They want to see it. They don't want to see pieces of paper. So we just decided, let's go for it. So we just used paper and pen sessions as warm-ups to get it going. Because if you're investing in video, you don't want to have a lot of the preliminaries on video that's going to bore people. You want to let them get in contact with the target first and then immediately shift over to the video. So this was fundamentally a video project. It was not a paper and pen session project. It was a video project. And that was new to us. And then the issue was it going to be interesting to watch? So when we finally put it together, after all the sessions were sent in, it turned out to be nearly 4 hours. And there was a considerable amount of cutting to get it to nearly 4 hours rather than nearly 6 hours. And so we put it together, and then the question was, are people going to watch it? So I was actually pushing, said, okay, so we'd be Gone with the Wind. So what? It looks really interesting to me. I think people to watch it. And we were going to put it out as a single 4-hour DVD, a single 4-hour video. But that was a lot for streaming services like video on demand and stuff. Even if you download it onto your computer, downloading a 4-hour video for video on demand, that seemed like a lot. And DVDs were impossible. We just wouldn't be able to do it on a DVD. So then Dick Allgaier said, well, Courtney, just break it in half. Make it a 2-part. And that was the solution that we finally did. So we did a 2-part video. And so it's got 1 part. Part 1 focuses on the World Trade Center and everything that was involved in making those buildings collapse. And Part 2 is the Pentagon and then the organization of the groups that were involved in the overall New York and Washington, D.C. Events. Now, I started this thing thinking that this would be sort of a conservative project because I saw everything on TV. I just assumed everything was right, and there were terrorists that threw the planes into buildings, and the buildings collapsed and so on. I feel like an idiot now about that, but nonetheless, I sort of thought this was going to be a real easy, obvious target demonstrating that remote viewing works. And I really wasn't purchasing into the conspiracy theory stuff. And then the results started coming back, and they threw the official governmental story that we were told all the media just totally out. And since I designed the project, I knew everything was done totally blind. I knew everything was squeaky clean. I knew there was no violations, no information squeaked out to any of the viewers. I knew everything was, and I knew they really were in serious doubt the entire time because they really did believe I would never assign the 9/11 project. So to the very end, they were in total, complete doubt. I know that one for a fact because when we closed the project, we finished it up, we had Dick Allgaier and Daz Smith meet at a GoToMeeting. Now, GoToMeeting is like Skype, and they can see each other. And they could talk finally because they had absolutely no communication between themselves for the entire data collection process. And Daz Smith was in England, and Dick Allgaier on the opposite end of the planet in Hawaii. And so they were seeing themselves finally and saying, and they both were sweating it out. Dick Allgaier couldn't sleep for 36 hours because he thought he had screwed up totally because he knew that this stuff just looked like 9/11, but he knew it couldn't be 9/11, so he was just convinced that it was some esoteric target dealing with Mars or something, and he was going to be very embarrassed. And Daz was the same way. Daz was just thinking this is going to be a train wreck. And then during the GOTRA meeting, they opened up an email from me that disclosed what the target was. They clicked on the link, saw the target, and it was 9/11. The relief coming out of both of them was like palpable, and it was all recorded. So, I mean, you could have seen it a star system away. So it really worked.
Were they ticked off at all, Courtney?
No, they weren't ticked off because they understood it had to be done blind, and they knew that the doubt had to be there or they couldn't do their work. But when they realized it, they realized they didn't screw up, and that it was actually good. So no, they were not upset. However, some radio people were upset. Some people actually contacted me afterwards and said, "So you lied through your teeth?" And I said, "What can I say?" I mean, I said the only thing I lied to you about was whether we were going to do the 9/11 project because you asked it on air. You were stupid to ask the question in the first place. So I had to lie to you because otherwise I couldn't do the project. But some of them got really ticked off. But that's the nature of remote viewing. You can't tell somebody on air, let's do this project next, and actually do that project. So,
but I would just think, even from a safety perspective, like there's some of these targets, the people and the characters involved are still.
Yeah, we unraveled everything. And so your question is, were they concerned that I had assigned them a target or a set of targets that could get them in trouble?
Exactly, yeah.
And we did discuss that afterwards, and everybody seemed gung-ho with going forward with the thing. But you can't get to that spot until you do it.
Hey, Jerry.
So we didn't discuss it a lot.
There are known knowns and unknown unknowns.
Now, where have I heard that before?
If you've seen the video,
yeah, I certainly
you get an idea.
Illinois.
Mr. Illinois and all that.
They were very excited. The remote viewers were very excited about the whole thing. There were a couple pieces, I'll tell you, I will confess, there were a couple things we clipped out because they seemed too controversial and they were not corroborated by both viewers. But that will come out too eventually, probably within the next few months when we release the full unedited sessions. We had they go on a long time, so there'll have to be a separate release for all of Dick's and a separate release for all of Daz's. But you'll learn nothing major new, but there's a couple pieces in there that we had to edit out simply because they weren't corroborated. And I knew people would extrapolate, and people who are not trained with remote viewing would draw conclusions that you couldn't draw. So, but what we have out there is a ton of information about what really happened with 9/11, and none of it matches what's now accepted as the official government conspiracy theory. And the stuff that I was sort of minimizing, not taking seriously, especially stuff coming out from the architects and engineers group, the pilots groups that are associated with studying the 9/11 stuff. I've now become very familiar with their arguments, and our remote viewing now backs up a lot of what they're saying. But the official governmental story is just simply bonkers.
It actually sounded a lot to me like some of the stuff I've heard about the Israeli involvement. Particularly, there's one point where I think Dick picked up on something, kept getting the word Popeye, and he didn't understand what it was. Well, when I was watching it, I Googled I put Popeye and submarine together, and sure enough, it's an Israeli submarine missile, a surface missile.
Yeah, but there are some other countries that have Popeye missiles. The U.S. has Popeye missiles as well. So
yeah, but apparently they don't call them by that name. The designation of Popeye, from what I read, is only an Israeli designation.
I've actually read the reverse. So
okay.
But that's there are some things like that that are not answered in the video. But the other thing is that let us talk not about Israeli ideas, but just foreign stuff, anything. So if you were going to have a orchestration of the 9/11 events for whatever reasons, then you might have to have some foreign assistance, and you had to pick and choose that carefully. And whoever, if there was any assistance from any foreign country dealing with it, it would be done under great pressure, meaning no foreign country would easily accept to participate in something like that, because if it ever did come out, the repercussions would be horrifying. So would be very risky. So if it was done, if there was any foreign, don't look at any foreign stuff as culprits. It all started in Washington. So it has, this is very important for people to do, for people to understand that these remote viewing data, if they are correct and they're very consistent and they do match the physical evidence, all the anomalies in the physical evidence now, the official government story does not match the physical evidence. So I'm assuming that the remote viewing story is in fact correct, that if there was any other sort of non-U.S. involvement in this, it would have been done under considerable duress. Nobody would have done it just like, hey, that's a good idea, let's go help them out. It would have been, they would have, think of the mafia in the Godfather movie, and Marlon Brando says to this undertaker, I'm going to help you out with your request, and there will come a time, maybe, when I will need assistance from you. And at that point, it'll be expected that you will do it or else. And, the undertaker said, well, okay, thinking that maybe it wouldn't happen. But then a time did come when the Godfather said, now we need help from you, and you must do it or else. And, the guy had no problem. So, he did it. So what do? Do you blame the undertaker, or is it the Godfather's plan? So in this case, this was clearly from the remote viewing perspective an inside job. And it was very complicated. It was one of the most complicated and sophisticated attempts to manipulate mass public perceptions probably ever. And you're ultimately going to have to ask questions like motive, like why would they do such a thing? And I'm not going to come down on the idea that it was just a lot of greedy, self-serving SOBs that were just stealing. I mean, probably everybody that was associated with it was thinking patriotically in their own weird way. And there's a reason for how they sort of came out that way. And other people would have said, that's bonkers, that's sort of nuts. The only thing I can say about it, and we haven't actually gotten into any of the details yet, but the only thing I can say about it is you should be asking yourself why I'm on your show. And it's not like, are you not a good show to be on or something? That's not it. I mean, but why am I talking? Like, why weren't we stopped? Because if this was a big deal, if this was an internal orchestrated event, then, why wouldn't we have been stopped from doing it? Well, if you look at let's bring up the UFO phenomena, for example. If you look at the UFO phenomena, now this is something that you have to consider hearsay, but I know is fact because it happened to me. I've actually spoken or, communicated with some people who are actually involved with this. The intelligence people have disrupted UFO groups since the 1950s. They typically do it, there's a whole different ways they do it, but they typically do it by infiltrating the group, having people join, and then start infighting and squabbles, and eventually people in disgust sort of break up. The idea is that the UFO groups should never grow to be big and influential. So they just break them up a long time as time goes on, so that there's a large coherent voice doesn't spread out into the mainstream. So you can say, well, why hasn't this happened with the 9/11 if they're so good at that? And that's a really good question. But if you look at the architects and engineers group and the pilot groups, especially the ones that studied the Pentagon attacks, and then the 9/11 truthers, 9/11 truthers, that's a very valid question. No one's stopping them. They're growing. I mean, it's literally since 2006, it's like a cottage industry. No one's interfering with them. And they're growing and growing and growing. And You have people like Ed Asner, great actor and also former president of the Screen Actors Guild, the job once held by Ronald Reagan, hosting, documentaries that you can see on YouTube about it, and tons of very official people from 2-star generals on down, and lots of authoritative people, architects, engineers, pilots, airlines pilots. I mean, the works. Testifying that or not testifying in court, but clearly stating that the government story is not correct, and saying that other things happened. Well, you can sort of say, well, why is this happening? And the only reason that can happen, in my view, the only reason is that right now the government is really split. Meaning there's got to be a big war going on right now behind the scenes. Now, I'm just going to arbitrarily cut it in half, but it's not half, because the 9/11 people actually were quite small in the groups that actually did it. But let's just, for making an easy discussion, say half. So half of the government people, the intel people and so on, are royally ticked at what happened. And the other half are like, wanting it all to go away, the ones who were involved with it and so on. So the only reason I'm on your show, and the only reason the 9/11 truthers are out there, and the architects and engineer groups, and then the pilot groups, the only reason everybody's still out there doing this stuff and so well organized is because somebody's protecting them. That means the half of the government that's really ticked off that this happened is protecting these groups and actually wants this stuff to come out. So this remote viewing study, although it may seem esoteric to people who don't know much about remote viewing, for those who do know about remote viewing, it's not esoteric, and for those who don't know about us, the quality of the viewers, the track record of the viewers, the public track record of the viewers who have been published, peer-reviewed journals. I mean, it's the whole thing. It's not in doubt when they see these type of things. In addition, even if the masses aren't really locked into remote viewing, there are many, many, many governments, Europe, Asia, and so on, that are very aware of remote viewing, and they're very aware of the Farsight Institute and the stuff we do. So as soon as we publish these results, they all got it. So in terms of the big governments on the planet, the total secret's now out. It's gone. It's done. It's over. And so that was the real thing. It wasn't so much that the masses would find out, but that every major government on the planet would find out. And all the details that we have in the studies would come out, which are tons of details. So they know exactly now what actually did happen. There's no ambiguity anymore. So this is, this could only happen if we were allowed to do it. Somebody had to clear the way for this to happen. Otherwise, we're a small organization. We could have been snuffed out like a gnat being squashed. So the fact that we did come out with this stuff. In fact, when I revealed the targets to Dick and Daz after the whole thing was over, that was a question that was raised. Are we going to be allowed to publish this? And my response to them was, well, that's a very good question, but I'm really thinking we would have been stopped long before this.
Has that ever happened previously, Courtney, with any of your work?
We've been disrupted so seriously, but that was only in the late 1990s. After that, we really were not disrupted, and they let us alone, and we had the military people on our board of directors, so we were really trying to play it team players. And also, we weren't so big. In the late 1990s, we were getting a lot of visibility, especially on shows like the Art Bell Show, which was a big show at those days, 40 million listeners worldwide. And that was something that the intel community didn't like. And they actually, the suits, we call them the suits, they actually sent someone that we would recognize and we knew was a card-carrying intel member to our offices. And he sat down with us and told us exactly what the suits told them to tell us, which was that they were gonna tap down on us. They didn't want to extinguish us, but they wanted to tap down on us, and they told us what they were going to do. And then that changed, and they decided they were going to try to snuff us out entirely, but it didn't work, but we kept on going. But nonetheless, we were sufficiently battered down in the late 1990s that they thought we wouldn't be a bother, so they just left us alone. And then we continued to work on the science, and then they became sort of interested in what we were doing because we were not trying to get a lot of attention, which is what they didn't want. They didn't want us to gather a lot of attention. And at the same time, we were doing interesting experiments, which they were interested in. So they let us keep going. And then we started to grow, and our credibility and our base was getting larger. Finally, we became clearly recognized as the premier venue for innovative public scientific studies of remote viewing phenomenon as it's done using the methodologies that were military or military derived. And but then we sort of put the military guys on our board of directors, and that helped settle things. But then those guys are retired, but they're still very good friends, and they're still emeritus members of the board. But then we decided, I decided finally, after the Giza project, I just said, look, I've been holding off on the 9/11 project forever. I don't want to die a coward. Let's just do this thing. And if we're halfway through it and they don't want us to do it, somehow they have ways to let us know. They'll either send somebody to my house and set me down and say, Courtney, you're not going to do this. Or something would have happened. So I just set up the targets. I had made the preparations for years, letting the remote viewers know that we'd never do the project. So everything was sort of set in that regard. I knew we'd get good data. And I knew we'd be able to go through enough targets to resolve the problem, to resolve the mystery, if there was one. And I was expecting, honestly, that the mystery we're going to solve is that the conspiracy theories were wrong. And so that would be the resolution of the mystery. But I had to write the targets so that we could find out the truth of what was going on regardless. And then when the results came in, the first thing I did was look at myself and saying, is anybody stopping me? So then it became clear that we weren't going to be stopped, so I just kept on going. And the results came in. And during the process, sort of the middle of the process, that's when I realized that the non-official story is going to be true. And then I really started to dig in seriously to the unofficial, conspiracy theory ideas that were ridiculed by the mainstream, but really had a ton of data that were absolutely rock solid, which I honestly didn't really know about before. And I became sort of an expert at what they were talking about. So I really became familiar with what the pilot groups were talking about. I myself am a pilot, so I can understand what they were saying. And I became familiar with what the architects and engineers groups were talking about. I listened to the stuff on the web, the Ed Asner stuff, they have documentary stuff, they have lots of web stuff, they have lots of publications. So I became sort of very familiar with that and constantly expecting that somebody might knock on my door. And let me be honest, if somebody, they know that if they knocked on my door and said, Courtney, stop this project, I would have stopped the project. I mean, I'm not a fool. They have vast resources. It's not that if I was brave enough, I would have continued. If they wanted this project to stop and I wasn't going to stop the project, that would have just been the end of me. Not necessarily physically like dying, but they could have caused all types of problems in my life, and I would not have been able to proceed. So they wouldn't have had to go to that step, and they knew that they wouldn't have had to go to that step. They knew that the only thing that they would have had to have done is say, Courtney, stop the project, and that would have been the end of it. And it never happened. So before Daz and Dick got their feedback of what the targets were, I was totally convinced that we were going to be allowed to publish this thing. So they got the feedback, and then they raised a question, and at that point I was like very confident saying, no guys, we would have been stopped a long time ago if we were not going to be able to publish this thing. Somebody out there wants this stuff to come out, so let's just proceed and make it the best we can. Let the information come out. Let us be squeaky clean with how we present this stuff. And so that's how it happened. So, Paul, to be quite honest, don't be upset with the government. The government wants this out. You may be upset with parts of the government that got involved in this in the first place, but trust me, there's a whole nother section of the government that is even more ticked off than you are about what happened.
Yeah, now that it's been 13 years, there are new wars, new conspiracies, new problems.
Yeah.
And to some extent, this is becoming like the Kennedy case.
Yeah.
It's, people are resigned, including in government, that, it's history. And, there are factions who don't like what happened, but that doesn't mean we're getting out of Iraq anytime soon or Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, look at it this way. Let's look at the idea of the public being tricked to go into a war. It's not new. Bismarck, for example, was at a time when they had German principalities in the 1800s. And he wanted to create a German nation. And to do that, he had the Wilhelm I, who was in Prussia, conspired to get his relative, I believe it was a nephew, to be king of Spain. And Napoleon III, now that's not Napoleon Bonaparte, but it was his heir. Napoleon, again the heir of Napoleon Bonaparte, found out about it and was royally ticked, because then there would have been sort of a German leadership on both sides of France. And so he was really ticked, and he angrily sent the ambassador to Wilhelm I and said, "Don't you dare do that or else." And Wilhelm was, quite okay with that. He said, "Look, didn't mean to upset you, just relax, we won't do it again." And so the ambassador, the French ambassador to Prussia, said, "Okay, don't worry, Wilhelm's all in for it, so everything will be okay." Well, Bismarck intercepted that telegram. It was called the Elm telegram, E-L-M. And when Bismarck intercepted the telegram, he rewrote it and basically said, he gave him the bird. He gave Napoleon the bird and said, "We're going to do whatever we blankety-blank want. You can't do anything about it. Go jump in a blankety-blank lake." And when Napoleon got it, he blew a cork. And he said, "How dare you?" And so he declared war. And so he sent his troops eastward into the German principalities. So, and of course, Bismarck never told anybody what he did with the Elm telegram. And all the people in the German principalities were shocked. They said, "My gosh, what did we do? We were just doing nothing and you're invading us. This is crazy." So they looked like France was like back in the old days with the Napoleon Bonaparte thing. Like they looked like they were, righteously aggrieved, and that the French were involved in attacks that were without any reason. And so the German principalities united as a nation. They became a nation then. And they were outraged that they were being attacked without reason. And Bismarck got his nation. And the leader became Wilhelm I, and Bismarck became the chancellor, and they got their nation. They defeated Napoleon, and in 1871 captured Paris. Because when a country's upset that they've been attacked unfairly, you can't stop them. I mean, the amount of psychic energy involved in that is big. So that worked out really well. And if you look at Pearl Harbor, for example, the situation in the Pacific was well known to Franklin Delano Roosevelt that there was going to be a major incident with the Japanese in the Pacific. And he was meeting with Churchill in a destroyer in the North Atlantic, and Churchill was begging him, "Look, this is the Nazis we're talking about. They're bombing London. Enter the war now." But FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, did not want to enter the war at the time that, similarly to the way Woodrow Wilson entered in World War I, when he had a split nation, because America at that time was very isolationist. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a lot of people that were quite hostile to the idea of fighting European wars, such as Joseph Kennedy, the father of Ted Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and John Kennedy, who was fiercely anti-British, in fact. And there was, if FDR was going to enter the war in Europe, he knew he had to have a united nation. So he had to wait for the incident in the Pacific. Now, this is not in dispute, and although there are many historians that don't know about this, but it's really not in dispute. Turner Catledge, who was the former editor-in-chief of the New York Times, has spoken extensively about this. You can see it yourself It's Leaders of the 20th Century video hosted by Henry Fonda. You can see it on YouTube. Go to the first part of the Roosevelt one. And you can see Turner Catledge on video talking about how Franklin Delano Roosevelt absolutely knew the major incident was going to happen in the Pacific and had to wait for it to happen. Now, he wasn't the only person to know. Some people sound like the ambassador of Austria. Other people knew, not Austria, Australia. But Turner Catledge was a big guy and editor-in-chief of the New York Times. He was a very close confidant of FDR. So, Franklin Delano, now this does not say that FDR knew about the specifics of the Pearl Harbor attack, but he may have. But he certainly knew that a big attack was coming. And he knew and he wanted it to happen. He knew that it had to happen in order for America to enter into war. He wasn't really concerned about the Japanese. He knew he could finish them off. The issue was the Nazis. Now, if you think about it, what would have happened if America didn't enter the war, if Pearl Harbor didn't happen, or if we went in divided, we weren't able to focus all of our attention on it? Well, the Nazis would have won, and the U.S. would have been history. We would have been defeated. We'd be a Nazi nation now. I mean, we would have been destroyed. They would have gotten the atomic weapon. I mean, it would have been a disaster of disasters. So even if Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor, no one's upset with them. It was okay, because it was like a holy war. The Nazis had to be defeated. But, Al-Qaeda, as nasty as they are,
Courtney,
they're
since
not
we're getting
the Nazis.
Well, Courtney, let me grab the topic here. Okay, since we're talking about Pearl Harbor, I think what's relevant in this video on 9/11 is that there is a group called the PNAC who called for a new Pearl Harbor. And I think it was Dick Allgaier who wrote that down in the video, the PNAC, the Project for the New American Century. And basically it's a similar thing. It's we need an event to further American domination of the world. And like you're saying, these people may have simply strong patriotism as they see it, that the strong should dominate the world or must dominate or whatever. And that was in the video. That was in the one of the sessions there. And there you go. I mean, that's pretty strong stuff. I mean, the PNAC is quite well known. It's kind of a neocon group. And go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the issue is that the remote viewing data do seem to support the idea that there was a group that had long planned this thing out, and the Al-Qaeda people, I'm not saying that they don't exist or they didn't exist or they weren't on the planes, but from the remote viewing perspective, they appear to have been bit players that were unwittingly having the way cleared for them so that they could do things. And there are anomalies even in that. For example, in American Airlines Flight 77, there's no video coverage, despite the fact that there's videos all over the airports, there's no video coverage of Arab terrorists walking through the airport that day and getting onto the plane. And one of the sessions dealing with New York that's on the video, that's on the documentaries, indicates that at least one of the planes was being flown by a system called uninterruptible autopilot. Because, for example, Dick Allgaier, he went into the cockpit for one of them and found the real pilot at the plane, and he was like having a bad day. Nothing was worked. They flipped switches, no matter how strong they grabbed the yoke, nothing worked. So it was a perfect description of something that Dick Allgaier at the time did not know about, which is uninterruptible autopilot. He was describing it, but the description of it was perfect. Now, uninterruptible autopilot is where somebody else outside of the plane is controlling it. Now, that has been available for commercial installations since the patents were filed in December 2006, but it's been long available before that for military applications. You don't file the patents until you want to let the technology become public, because you actually have to tell people what it is and how it's done in order to get the patent. So when you want to deal with a military strictly secret application, you don't file the patents. So that had long been available to the military, and it would have been a piece of cake for the military to install uninterruptible autopilot in any number of commercial jets. There are many commercial jets now have it, for the idea of safety. If something should happen to the pilots, would the airlines be able to fly the jets to a safe landing spot? But what Dick Allgaier describes in his remote viewing session is a perfect example of uninterruptible autopilot. And you can see Dick sort of puzzling, like, they can't move this thing. They can't move the yoke. It was flying by itself. And if you were going to orchestrate such a set of events, such as the 9/11 events, you have to ask yourself, would you rely on some nitwit Islamic terrorists who were bumbling beginner newbie pilots to be able to fly those planes first time and every time, not only into the Twin Towers, but into the Pentagon? I mean, would you rely on that? I mean, I'm a pilot myself, and when I was learning how to fly, I can't tell you the number of times that I would fly into an airport that had parallel runways. And let's say the two parallel runways, and the control tower clearly tells me to land on the runway to the left. And I make a turn to get to the left, but I don't turn quick enough, and I end up over the runway on the right. I'm over the wrong runway. Now, if there was another plane that was landing on the runway to the right, which did happen often, there would have been a mid-air collision. I was literally in the wrong spot. And fortunately, when I was landing at those runways, that didn't happen. And, if you take newbie pilots like those Islamic terrorists, when you say, well, flying into the Twin Towers, let me tell you that those buildings may seem big, but when you're flying at that speed, those things are hard to hit. I mean, it's really, and they were doing considerable aerobatics with those planes. I mean, the planes were twisting and turning, and that was not easy flying. You may think that's easy, but it's not easy to do that, and to rely on them being perfect hits every time. So it brings up that the idea of uninterruptible autopilot may actually have some validity to it. I'm not guaranteeing it wasn't corroborated by the other viewer, but it does make sense if this was an internal scripted set of events.
What other things from the sessions did you find particularly interesting?
Well, the Pentagon thing is fascinating. Since then I've become really quite well versed in the physical anomalies associated with the days of the attacks. And being a pilot, I now understand that it was physically impossible for a jet airliner to crash into the Pentagon the way it happened. Because what happened is the thing was flying at near supersonic speeds right over the treetops, like at 350 feet up over wires in the treetops. And then as soon as it got over the Pentagon grounds, again at near supersonic speeds, as soon as it got over the trees and it was over the Pentagon grounds, it had an immediate dive, a real steep dive. It got to 4 feet over the ground, 4 feet over the ground, and leveled out, and then flew completely level at 4 feet into the Pentagon walls. Well, the pilot groups, airliner pilots and stuff like that, they're very large. There's over 1,000 people in some of those groups. And the pilot groups that have organized about this 9/11 stuff, they have unambiguously said you can't do that with an airliner. It's like an albatross. It's like the Titanic. You can't. It doesn't matter how good a pilot you are. You can't get an airliner to do that. It's like a whale. I mean, it just doesn't move that fast. You can't have it dive from the trees, level out 4 feet over the ground, and fly horizontally. It just physically can't do it. But even if it could do it, only the absolute best Top Gun pilots, better than Tom Cruise, the absolute best Top Gun pilots could have done that. But even with those pilots, they couldn't have done it with an airliner. So, that's really very anomalous. And then the hole in the Pentagon is too small for an airliner. And whatever did hit the Pentagon had no wings. There were no wings in the wreckage, and there's no marks on the sides of the Pentagon where the wings would have hit. I mean, there were no wings in whatever hit the Pentagon. So, it's a real interesting sort of question. So the Pentagon attacks are really very interesting because the remote viewing results actually were very clear on that, in the sense that it was a missile of some type, like a cruise missile. And but actually what is also very interesting, and I don't mind talking about some of the details of the thing, is that we also came up in part 2 of the documentary. It's a 2-part documentary. And again, your listeners can see the trailer as well as the documentaries by going to www.farsight, F-A-R-S-I-G-H-T, like seeing far.org, O-R-G. And from my perspective, one of the most interesting things is that the remote viewers, unlike a physical eyewitness, remote viewers are eyewitnesses that can flirt around. They can flit around. They can go from place to place. And Daz was really very good, although it was backed up also by the same type of stuff that Dick was getting. But Daz was really very good at piecing together the organizational stuff and actually made like a flow chart of what groups were involved, how many were in each one, and so on. And then Dick did a similar thing with some of their activities, including working in offices, producing forged documents. And then he even had a good picture that was finished as a painting done on a Wacom tablet of the guy in charge, the top guy in charge. So, and his personality and the types of orders he was giving. I mean, the details, the level of details in these documentaries is astounding. But that's what you get when you deal with the absolute best viewers on the planet. And what really was so interesting for me is that absolutely nobody, not a single person that has watched the documentary so far, has complained that the nearly 4 hours was boring, even in the slightest. In fact, what people say is that they watched the first one dealing with the World Trade Center attacks, beginning that, thinking that they were a little tired, and then we'll end up, watching the next one some other day.
Hey,
and by the time they get done with the first one, they just tell me that they couldn't put it down. They started the second one and didn't go to sleep till 4 in the morning or something.
Am I crazy to think that the fellow that Dick thought was in charge?
Don't give us a name. Don't give us a name. But because we want to stay out of any legal liability issue. But
okay.
But a lot of people do. I mean, it's a very clear picture. But a lot of people, and some people have said also, at this pregnant moment in the radio broadcast, it resembles a lot of people. So if you were going to go in the direction of giving a name, can you not do that for us, please?
All right. But I think anybody who watches the video and has any familiarity with some of the personalities around that event will, I think, will come to a startling conclusion on who it was. But I guess we'll have to leave it at that. So.
Yeah, we have to, because there's legal liability issues.
Sure. Okay.
But understand that the finished graphics were done totally blind. In fact, Daz's flowcharts of the different organizations, what they were doing, the top-tier people at the top, the other groups of people who had weapons but were used mostly as spotters, and the other groups that were used to infiltrate the World Trade Center buildings and lace them with explosives. They wore jumpsuits, came in vans, worked in the middle of the night, the different groups. The flowchart he did, even that is like a polished thing. All that was done totally blind. He didn't have any access. None of that was done, whether the picture of the person you're talking about, painted on a Wacom tablet, the flowcharts, everything, as polished as all that stuff is, nothing was done after the targets were revealed. All of it was done totally blind, which makes it so fascinating. This is what you get. Yeah. By the way, we have some innovations that we're going to do for our next project. So we have, we've been highly innovative in how to do this. And now the remote viewing community knows that everyone's now aware, I think, in the remote viewing community, that the paper and pen stuff is really very limited in its ability to persuade people that remote viewing is real. It's not that it doesn't work, the paper and pen method. It's just that showing people paper and pen stuff is just not gonna bring it out of. There'll always be just a few thousand people in the whole planet that are interested in looking at that stuff. So the future is really among remote viewers who train to do this under video conditions.
Yeah, Courtney, I have a question for you. I was really curious about the blocking that one of the remote viewers experienced when they were trying to look at something? Were
Yeah.
they ever able to do anything about that, or how did that work?
Yeah, actually, that's a real interesting story. We have not experienced any blocking of any of our projects since the late 1990s. So we know that it occurs, and we have anti-blocking methods for getting around it, but we haven't run into it for a long time. This was the first time we actually ran into it. So what you're talking about is a session that Dick did where he was actually going into something that looked to him like an NSA facility type thing. And there was shielding all over the place. And they were sort of monitoring everything, setting up things, getting things. They were like active during the day of the events. And not just following it, but executing it. So they had camouflage, but they had all types of electronic shielding, everything you can imagine. And then he noticed that they also had remote viewing blocking as well. Well, before this session actually hit, which is what you're referring to, I discovered that remote viewing blocking was being used for the entire project. And that was really, really interesting when I finally decided, when I finally was unambiguous that it was happening. It was so exciting for us because we haven't run into that since the late 1990s, and it was an easy fix to get around it, but it was so exciting to actually run into absolutely unambiguous blocking because that meant that we were onto something. So it was like, imagine the teenage hacker that gets into the big corporate computer system, and notes that there's all types of defenses. Now he can get around, or she can get around those defenses, but notes these like new types of defenses. Well, the teenage hacker, what happens to the teenage hacker? Does the teenage hacker sort of say, oh gosh, darn, it's so disgusting, now I can't get into this? Or does the teenage hacker sort of say, yay, this is a challenge, this is great, and then dives in? Well, that's what happened. So that's what we were like. We ran into the blocking and we said, wow, this is so cool. This is great. We haven't run into that in the longest time. So I on my end, without having to let Dick or Daz know anything, I instituted the anti-blocking stuff. It has to deal with how the things are tasked. And it just blasted through it immediately, and all the blocking went away. But it was so fun to actually run into it. But yeah, they even tried the remote viewing blocking on that. As well as every other type of thing, that you can imagine. Faraday cages, everything was shielded. I mean, this was one of the most heavily cloaked operations, but it was really great to actually know that even the remote viewing was being blocked. That was cool.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say that I found the videos myself absolutely astounding, and actually, but also very disturbing. I actually was not able to watch them all the way through. In fact, I started it and then had to stop after about half an hour because I was just kind of shaken,
Yeah.
But my husband had a question though, and this is sort of playing devil's advocate because,
Sure.
we're both trained in not in remote viewing, but in basic other sorts of far seeing and things. So yeah. He's not discounting it, but he was curious. He was saying, because I said, look, I said, either this is the world's biggest hoax, which I don't believe for a minute it is, or they really saw this. And he said, well, there's a third possibility. And I said, what's that? And he said, I'm not saying this is what happened, but is there any possibility that they could be seeing something like a movie being made about this 20 years from now? Now, I think you have ways to make sure that doesn't happen, but I thought it might be interesting to explain to people, if you can do that simply, why that probably wouldn't be what they were seeing, or maybe it is. I don't know.
Well, if that was what we were doing, then the only conclusion to draw is that we have absolutely zero control over the remote viewing phenomenon itself. Because the whole idea of remote viewing, as it's done using the military-derived procedures, is that we have control over the perceptual process. So in the early days, first couple decades of the remote viewing research, there was a misunderstanding of how the actual focus of perception occurred for the viewers. Like, why should the viewers focus on one thing versus another? Why should they actually remote view and get a target? And so the early remote viewing researchers did not understand that the analysts, or the actual researchers themselves, could not be isolated in time and space from the actual remote viewing process. So the researchers set up all types of experimental designs that fatally corrupted the remote viewing process. But because these remote viewing designs did corrupt the remote viewing process, they left telltale signs. And it was those telltale signs that eventually led us to understand what was actually causing the perceptions to focus on one thing rather than another. So we cleared it up, and I wrote a book about that. And that's a book called Remote Viewing, The Science and Theory of Non-Physical Perception. And it's specifically dealing with those experimental designs that fatally corrupted experiments, and then the data gathering elements of those experiments, and then the solutions for that. And that the book, you can actually see a link to it on the front page of our website, www.farsight.org. And so once we found out what causes the perceptions to focus on one thing versus the next, versus something else, we were able to control the remote viewing process well, so that we can clearly get viewers to focus on the target we want them to focus on, and not on anything else.
So you have ways. So to clarify for beginners, especially for people that don't know a lot about these things, you do have a way to control for things like to make sure that the target is X and cannot be a movie made about it 50 years later.
Yeah, because what actually makes the perception focus in, the remote viewer is doing this session for the intent of satisfying the informational needs of the analyst, the person who's going to be taking that information and comparing that information with the target. And so there is a telepathic connection at the time that the remote viewing is being done with the tasker or with the analyst at the time that the sessions are being analyzed in the future. So the analyst's thoughts have to be clear and unambiguously associated with the actual target when the session is being looked at for the first time. Now, what the early researchers used to do is they used to use a experimental design which was pick a target out of 5, where they'd have one real target and 4 decoys. And the real target was picked by a computer or some random dynamic mechanism. And the judges would not know which is the real target, which is the 4 decoys. And so they'd look at the remote viewing session and then look at all 5 targets and try to see which target resembled the remote viewing data the best. And then afterwards, they would find out which target the computer chose. Well, it turned out that the computer didn't matter at all. The computer had nothing to do with the thing. There was a telepathic connection between the remote viewers and the judges had all 5 targets in their heads. So all 5 targets were legitimate. There was no 4 decoys. Now, statistically, the target that the computers used to choose did on average, turn out statistically to be more dominant as the choice that the judges would have. But it wasn't a big thing, but it was statistically significant. And the reason is that there was eventually more of a mental focus on that correct target after the computer actually picked it. The judges would go back and focus on the data and look at that particular target. So there was a little bit more of an intellectual focus on that. So statistically, they would be able to say they've got some results, but they were not correct in continuing with that experimental design as long as they did, because they clearly had a leakage, because many sessions would come in that were perfect descriptions of the other targets. And they even developed statistical procedures for dealing with that called the stacking effect, the non-independence across target pools, which was really stupid. But at the time that they did it, it was an interesting experiment, but it was stupid to keep going with it, given the fact that there was obvious information leakage. So once we figured out what was actually happening, the whole thing cleared up. So with the targets like this, what we do here is that when the sessions are done, it's very important that the analyst, in this case it was me, when I opened the session, I made sure my mind was calm. Mm-hmm. I looked at no other targets. I would clearly reread the target. My desk would be clear. I'd reread the target. I'd infuse my mind with that target and only that target, that it was specifically dealing with, say, the the North Tower or the South Tower or Building 7 or the Pentagon, whatever, and I'd focus on just that one. And when my mind was settled and I really had only that specific target on my mind, I'd open up their sessions and watch it. So that's the process. That process, by the way, is called closing, when you close the time loop, when you close it. Go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say, but how do you that time loop, that's getting to what I was curious, how do you control for time? Because in my experience, time in the other world is probably the hardest thing to keep from sort of getting either away from you or understanding or figuring out.
Well, it doesn't exist. And, you know, I'm a mathematician, and in the realm of cosmology, the time divides out of those equations. And so it's really a very, I mean, you can mess with time with the equations for a long while, but you keep on going with them, and they eventually divides out. So it's always been sort of an enigma for physicists. But with remote viewing, it's very clear that the past, present, and future happen simultaneously. So, and that they still exist, so that the World Trade Center events and the Pentagon events, the 9/11 events, are happening now as we speak. They're not like something that's gone. And so we're looking at them 13 years into the future, or actually longer than that, or it's about 13 years into the future. We're looking at them 13 years into the future, but we're looking at things that are simultaneously happening. So our 13 years in the future is happening at the same time that those events are happening. And, you know, that's, there's no real separation in the sense that once it's in the past, it doesn't exist anymore, and it's only in history books. That's not the case.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, that's why we know it's not a movie, because of the way the processes that we've developed for when the analysis is going. I don't have a movie on my mind when I'm closing their sessions, when I'm analyzing their sessions. I have the actual event on my mind.
So basically, the person doing the targeting is the one who needs to control for that.
Yeah, it's very important for the tasker and the analysts to have solid control of their minds when they're actually doing their stuff. I'll give you a sort of a interesting anecdotal but true story. There was a session where it was being done in a training session over speakerphones with a remote viewer and a monitor. And the monitor was listening to the remote viewer describe the target, and the target was in front of them, was in front of the monitor, was in front of the person that was, you know, in charge. And the remote viewer was in another place, and they were connected using speakerphones. And the monitor started to get bored. The monitor is not a television monitor, it's a person. The monitor started to get bored during the session, and he stood up and started walking around his basement, listening to what the remote viewer was describing, and the remote viewer was describing the target quite well. And the monitor started to walk around his basement and started looking at these books on bookshelves, dusty books, and then suddenly over the speakerphone he heard, wow, there's been a change. The target's not the same anymore. Now it's like there's bookshelves and like there's dust all over the place. And then the monitor realized what was happening. He was picking up the viewer was picking up the monitor's own thoughts. The monitor quickly went back to the desk and started staring at the target picture. And then the remote viewer on the speakerphone said, oh, now things have shifted back. We're back to the original target. And then he continued the session. So your thoughts are key. It's like the analyst is like a laser pointer. The thoughts of the analyst matter. It's like a laser pointer that targets that actually gets the focus of the remote viewers on a single spot.
Hey, Courtney, then a quick, hopefully quick question out of that is, if somebody's thinking about the target and they have an opinion about what happened on 9/11, can that influence the results?
Yes, it can. That's why it's important for people to disclose what their presumptions were going into it. If I was, because in a multiple reality type of world, anything can happen. Anything can happen, and everything does happen. So there's a reality. This addresses another project of ours called the Multiple Universe Project. There's a reality in which you're not interviewing me, but interviewing tonight somebody else, or I'm wearing a different color shirt, and you are interviewing me, or anything can happen. So if the analyst and the tasker has certain predispositions, sort of belief systems, you can end up remote viewing a reality that is real, but may not be the reality that is in your specific time stream. So it's actually very important for the analyst to have sort of an unbiased, clear, open mind with regard to expectations. So what we do is we say, what are when we're closing the sessions, this is what we do. The analyst, knowing that the analyst's minds, the analyst's thoughts is actually going to influence what happens with the remote viewer. The analyst has to, what we do is we identify the verifiable elements in the target. Meaning, before I look at the session, before I watch the video of the person doing the session, I look at the target, I look at the HTML page for it. It's not on the web, but it's done in HTML on my personal computer. And I look at just the verifiable things. And I said, for this target, what should the viewer see that's clear in the target image and clear from what we know that's verifiable? And that's what I focus on. And I try to limit my thoughts away from anything else, just the verifiable stuff. And then I open the session or I watch the video, focusing my own thoughts on the verifiable things, knowing that those verifiable thoughts will help in directing the viewer to the things that we know actually happen. And literally keeping my thoughts away from any type of conclusions. It actually takes training to do this, but the training to be an analyst is actually as difficult as the training to be a remote viewer. And most people underestimate the importance of analysis. They don't realize that it determines everything that happens in the session as well, because of that telepathic link. So that's what I did with this project. I kept my mind focused on the verifiable components, and the verifiable components for the data that came in were spectacular. The only issue is that the data also came in with everything else, which is, the stuff that was not verifiable. And my jaw was dropping for that because that was not expected. So the two things you do is you do the analysis the way you do it, where I described it, but also I declare later what my expectations were. So in case people were worried about that, they can at least know. So that's why I even mentioned in the beginning of this show what my expectations were. I was actually expecting the government story to be correct because I saw it on TV. It looked real to me, and so this is a situation where my expectations turned out to be totally bonkers.
Well, maybe that's good. Then, if you come into it convinced that it was, an elaborate, technical event or whatever, then maybe the results would have been slightly different. But getting back to the sessions, what other things stood out? I was impressed with what I saw as mini nukes.
Well, that's an issue. See, we have evidence in these data of clearly non-nuclear explosives being laced. I mean, Dan Smith is really clear, not just in describing the explosives, but how it was put in. He is so clear in describing the guys in jumpsuits, in vans in the middle of the night, going in. You have to come in like after 3 in the morning and leave before 5:30 so that the 6 o'clock in the morning AAA personality type guys don't see you. And so this would have to be done like weeks in advance and lace the buildings with these explosives. But on the other hand, Dick Alkire also came in with the idea that there might have been some nuclear detonation as well. Now, a lot of your listeners may be rolling their eyes at this point and saying, gosh, that shows you how crazy it was because of the nuclear idea, because they're thinking Hiroshima and Nagasaki and stuff like that. But they do actually have, now I'm not arguing that this is what happened, but they do actually have very, very, very small nuclear weapons that have a very, very slight radiation output. So it's not dirty like the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, to give you an example of a very small nuke, is when the hydrogen bomb went off, when the hydrogen bomb was exploded for the first time. How do you detonate a hydrogen bomb? You detonate it with an extremely small atomic bomb. Those are really small. But in the old days, they used to cover those atomic bombs with uranium so that when they exploded, it was really dirty and there was radiation all over the place. Well, they don't do that anymore. So they can explode an atomic bomb and actually there is radiation afterwards, but it's nothing to write home about. But anyway, so Dick noted in his session that it felt like there was an atomic explosion in at least one of the buildings, and it would have been one of those extremely small atomic things, and the radiation that came out of it, he describes, he says, it's not a lot of radiation. I mean, it's like really clean, but if there was Geiger counters right here at the time, they would have picked it up. They would have noted that something was there. And that's exactly how those bombs detonate, those really small ones. They call them suitcase-sized nuclear weapons because they can be carried around like in a suitcase. And you can't do that if they're dirty, if they have a lot of radiation stuff in it. So you have to understand atomic weaponry has really advanced. So Dick Elgar did have some interesting information suggesting that. And in terms of the facts on the ground, there is support for it in some sense because the buildings, the World Trade Center buildings, the Twin Towers, as well as to some extent the Building 7, they were, well, you can either say they were pulverized or vaporized or both. Now, some people would say that they were pulverized, but the remote viewing data do seem to suggest that they were also partially vaporized, meaning that there was they were broken up into pieces. They were like dust. It wasn't like a pile of stuff, like a 30-story pile of stuff. Now, I recently got an email from a very interesting email from someone who was describing that the stuff was there, but just sort of scattered all about. But, you know, regardless, if it was scattered all about, it would have been explosive stuff. Like if you pulverize something or vaporize or both, you're still talking about explosive type of event that scatters that stuff. But both Dick and Daz described it as essentially at least partially vaporized and pulverized, both in the particulate matter, a lot of dust particulate matter coming out, but a lot of it being molten. And if it's molten, some of it's boiling off. So I mean, it's, you know, the thing is that those buildings, if they collapsed just as a result of jet fuel and structural issues, it would have been a huge mountain of stuff. You wouldn't have had the pulverization or the pulverization with some vaporization. You wouldn't have had that. You would have had just a pile of junk, and you essentially got a crater. The whole building was gone. So, I mean, there were like girders and stuff like that, but essentially 100+ stories of building was gone. And so the idea of an explosion with some type of very sophisticated conventional weaponry does seem to be supported by the data. And that's clearly also described by Daz. But there is also the possibility that you might have had something more potent in it that would have pulverized the buildings the way we saw them, which would possibly lead to a thought about the atomic concept.
I mean, they were heavy objects that practically blew out, you know, hundreds of meters away or something. And
to dust.
But some of them were heavy too. I mean, there were pieces found, you know, a fair distance away. And if you just had a kerosene weakening some steel or something, things are just going to fall. They're not going to. Anyway, the energy requirement. You're into physics. The energy requirements
enormous,
to take
enormous.
steel and other things and to make them into small pieces, very small pieces, is dramatically greater than what you're talking about with something just weakening and falling. So
yeah, it's huge. And also the buildings were designed to withstand all types of stuff, including airline crashes, hurricane winds, and I could sort of believe that they could be knocked over, at least partially, if something really affected them. But they came down on their own footprint, all three buildings, Building 7 as well as the Twin Towers. And that's classic for what happens with demolition stuff. And if you look at Building 7, for example, and this is the thing that Ed Asner's the documentary that's hosted by Ed Asner really focuses on, as well as a larger documentary that is produced by the A&E Architects and Engineers Group. They really focus on Building 7, which is the third building and the original building of the World Trade Center. The videos of that are so clear. It was a sudden collapse, an explosion at the base, a sudden collapse, boom, on its own footprint. And that's exactly what a controlled demolition looks like. And never in the history of modern architecture, apparently without even a single example, has an office furniture fire, however big, brought down a building, a modern architectural building, because they're steel, structurally reinforced. They burn them out like a shell. I mean, you eventually have to knock them down with cranes and so on, but they never collapse like that. And that was a sudden, immediately collapse of a building, and the videos of it are so spectacularly clear. So really, it does, and really the point that is made in the video hosted by Ed Asner, and also the larger documentary from the A&E, is if you are going to bring down buildings like that with demolitions, you have to set that stuff up weeks in advance, and you can't do it on the day of the collapse. For example, Building 7 was on fire on that day because of stuff coming out of the other buildings. And it was not hit by an airplane, but it was on fire. And the chaos of the Twin Towers was right next door. It is impossible to think that the demolition people would have come in while the building was on fire and while the Twin Towers had all that chaos, and carefully set the demolition charges. Those demolition charges have to be set precisely with fiber optic cabling between them. Everything has to be set just right. It's a calm thing. You set it up weeks in advance. And so that's the big thing with the architects and engineers group, that it was impossible, if it was a demolition, and clearly all evidence indicates it was, you can't do that on the day of the thing. So it actually had to be set up long in advance, and that's the Achilles heel of the whole, what they now call the official government conspiracy theory.
Hey, Courtney.
Yeah.
Unless I missed something in the video, I mean, it was 4 hours long, but I don't think you guys targeted the Shanksville crash, did you?
No, we didn't. We had 7 targets, and I thought that was as much as I'd be able to push these guys, and it turned out to be correct. So I had to pull my punches. So the Pennsylvania Shanksville crash, I just left. You have to understand, we had 3 targets for each of the 3 buildings in the World Trade Center: the North Tower, the South Tower, and Building 7. So that's 3 targets. And the Pentagon was a devil of a thing that had to be sorted out, because it wasn't just did something hit the Pentagon. We had to find out whatever hit the Pentagon. We had to trace it back to the origin, where it was. Did it take off from a runway at Dulles International, or did it come from somewhere else, like a submarine, or some type of launching facility? And that was all very complicated to sort out. We needed separate targets for all of that. So the Pentagon itself took up 3 targets. One of the targets was literally trying to find American Airlines Flight 77, which is the one the government said hit the Pentagon. Because I said, well, if it did hit the Pentagon, we should find it. And so we tried to find it the day. No, we've never found it. We were trying to find it the day after the attack, meaning the day after September 11. Like, where was it? Was it sitting on a runway someplace, or was it shot down on the ocean, or was it in the rubble of the Pentagon? And we never found it. I don't know what happened to it, to be quite honest. Even the pilot groups that study this don't know what happened to it. And there's also a question. Anybody who's able to pull off something like this, they're able to do all sorts of things. I mean, like, really, was it just a computer blip? Was it a real thing? You don't hear much about the passengers on that one either. You hear about the passengers on the other planes, but you don't hear hardly anything about the passengers on that one. It's almost like a mystery thing. Anyway, what the remote viewing data is very clear, and it fits with the physical evidence. I don't know what happened to that plane, if there even was one, but it was, whatever hit the Pentagon was not, from the remote viewing perspective, was not a jumbo jet. Even if you look at the radar data, a jumbo jet can't do what it did, so it was not that. And even you have a 2-star general. For example, there's even a general who's gone on record saying that he saw an early version of the one sensor. All the video sensors of the Pentagon were turned off on that day, except for one. sort of distant, but he saw an early version, and to his recollection, the officially released version wasn't the same as the one he originally saw, and that this vague image of a jet on it wasn't in the original one. And you know, at this point, you can never trust anything video about that event, because anybody who was trying to pull something off like that would easily have access to Photoshop and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I mean, they would have resources that go way beyond anything you or I have to sort of make ends meet, sort of connect the dots for people.
So that's 6 targets. What was the other one?
The 7th target was added late.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because I wanted to have another shot at having the viewers identify whatever caused the pancaking collapse of the World Trade Center in terms of any preparations. So I wanted to look at the preparations, not actually what was happening at the moment that the attacks were going on, but preparations that were involved in it. So if the preparations were terrorists taking flight lessons, that's what we would have gotten. If the preparations were, you know, explosives being carefully placed in the buildings and NSA-type facilities doing their stuff, people working behind the scenes with forgery, meeting, corporate, business, governmental type of stuff with having meetings and things like that, if those with people in suits, if those are the preparations, we would have got that. Well, in that target, as well as all the other targets, we have no data describing crazy nitwit Arab terrorists flying those planes into the World Trade Center and other places as the cause of all those events. Now, that does not say that they weren't there. It's just that it says the interpretation of this is that whatever they were is minor. They were bit players, they were minor elements in this overall thing, but the big events, the big elements were these other things that were being done. So even if the Al-Qaeda people were on the planes, it wasn't significant. That was not what was really going on with that, according to these data. Anyway, so that 7th session, that 7th target was to look at preparations, and that was really my final test. I couldn't push the viewers beyond this at all. I mean, in fact, Dick just basically quit after that. He was so disturbed at what he thought was a horrific performance on himself. He just knew he just sort of did everything terrible and was going to be humiliated. He just basically quit after the 7th one. And Daz was saying the similar stuff. He says he's willing to stop on this thing. He couldn't go any further. So there was limits to how far you can do this. But all of that frustration on the viewers was telling me that they were in perfect psychological state to do this stuff. All that doubt, all that belief that they screwed up, that was perfect. Because that's their conscious mind. Their conscious mind is telling them, oh, I don't have a control over this, it's crazy. Which meant that the remote viewing data that were coming in were like spot on. So that was really, it was really good to hear that level of frustration on the viewers. And they forgave me afterwards when they saw the results. They're good sports. They're good sports about that.
Yeah, that's why remote viewing is so hard. Is that when you do it right, it feels wrong and painful and uncomfortable.
I mean, it's really hard to do this stuff. That's why there's only a few people. We've got to change that. We've got to have more people trained to this level of proficiency. But one of the great things about this set of documentaries is this documentary on this project is that people can actually see the data collected live, and it's spine-tingling. It's not boring while you're watching it. It's like, you say, almost 4 hours long. Are you serious? Is it going to be dreadful? And then you start watching and you're riveted. So people can see that the ultimate goal of remote viewing is not to be sitting at a desk alone writing down things on a piece of paper, but it's ultimately to be actively engaged in the target. So it's not just the writing on whiteboards describing it, but they're involved in the target. The reason it's so riveting is because these remote viewing sessions are live, meaning they are eyewitnesses at the target itself at the moment that the thing is actually happening. And you're not like in a court case interviewing an eyewitness that's trying to remember what something was like. You're actually watching the eyewitness watch it in real life, in real time. And so that's why it's so spine-tingling. You're actually watching. And if you remember, for example, do you remember that time when Daz Smith was describing one of the explosions? I think both he did this in the World Trade Center as well as the Pentagon, where he was on the side of the whiteboard after drawing some stuff, and then he walked in front of the whiteboard and said, now I'm walking into the explosion, and I feel all the particulate matter, the wind and everything. He started to use his hands. He actually walked right into the center of the event to experience what the explosion was like. That's what is going on. So that's why it's so riveting. You're actually like teleporting yourself right into the middle of the scene with the eyewitness, and the eyewitness is saying not what he or she remembered, but what he or she is seeing right now. And these people are doing this, and that people, and look over here. And that's why the level of tension in these videos is so great, because they're not remembered. They're literally live eyewitness reports right then and there. And you as the viewer, as the audience, knows the target, and you know that the viewer does not know the target, and the descriptions are coming in so clear. So it's like it is a real interesting mix. We didn't know if it would work in terms of video, but it worked, yeah.
And it's a lot more viscerally grabbing for us than something like, I don't know, underground, the Atlantis or something. That's very interesting, yeah. But 9/11 is much more personal for us. I mean, most of us have been to New York City, that kind of thing, right? It affected us in so many ways. So it's got much more of a pull to us. What about any other things that kind of stood out you'd like to get across before we wrap up today?
Well, I guess
found the missiles interesting. The idea of how missiles were targeted or whatever. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, the way the targeting was actually done, possibly using not just people on the ground, but possibly using like an AWAC to sort of make sure it actually hit the right spot. By the way, those missiles, cruise missiles, do fly exactly how the radar showed it to fly, meaning they are designed for extremely rapid maneuverability that can go right over trees, duck down immediately, fly 4 feet over the ground, and fly through someone's bathroom window. That's exactly what those missiles are designed to do. So the type of aerobatics that you saw with the Pentagon attack is classic for cruise missiles. It's not even possible for a jumbo jet, but that is what happens with cruise missiles. I guess my real sort of, I'm sort of interested in all the different aspects of it, but I'm a social scientist, so what I sort of, my take-home message when I sort of think of this whole thing is to show how it is possible to manipulate a mass audience so easily, and how cocky the people that try to do this can get. Like, for example, Bismarck, he threw all of Europe into a war, and he was unabashed about it, and he was great with just sort of, messing with the Elm telegram to get it to happen. When FDR allowed the Pearl Harbor thing to happen, he was completely okay knowing that the response would happen and allow the end to happen. And when later things happened, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin events, the first one was a very minor event, and the second one didn't happen at all, and then President Johnson went before Congress and asked for permission to use military force to defend our troops, our interests in Southeast Asia, and they gave it to him because of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. Well, it was later. The only thing that's really in dispute now is whether President Johnson knew he was lying to Congress about the incidents or whether he was duped. That's the only thing that's in dispute. And, now when you get to the 9/11 type stuff, you sort of say, well, this has become sort of a standard operating procedure for governments when they want to enter a war. And they're really cocky about how they can set it up. They sort of know they can get away with it. And the 9/11 event seems to be the biggest attempt ever to do that. And what is amazing is the hubris, the amount of confidence that they had, knowing that they could pull off such a complex thing. And to be quite honest, if it wasn't for the remote viewing stuff that actually allows you to tie it all together, they would get away with it. But so remember this. I would not be on your show. We would not be having this interview. The architects and engineers group would not exist as coherently as they are today. The pilots groups and everything, if there wasn't a huge, more than majority part of the government that wanted this information out. There's a huge battle going on behind the scenes right now, and we're all being protected or we wouldn't be talking today. I mean, I'm not saying somebody would shoot us, but we would be disrupted in some way so that we wouldn't be raising these issues in a coherent way on the radio and so on. So who's ever out there, this stuff is going to ultimately be revealed. And remember also that even though the masses may not be convinced yet, in terms of like 100% of the masses, all the major governments now know the whole story. And so it's only a matter of time before this is fully realized everywhere. So, you know, this is going to be a very interesting time period for us as a species, for being able to understand how to govern ourselves in very complex democratic societies, because this is not an authoritarian type of government that tricks its people and lies to its people and just does things by holding things back. This is a very modern democratic society, and the means for tricking the people to do something is much more sophisticated, but the details of how to do that apparently have been worked out.
Well, yeah, I think there's another side to it, though. I think that if the view in the world is that this was basically an inside job, that might also change the calculations. The people behind it might become more aggressive. They might feel that they have to achieve world domination, which perhaps was their goal in the first place, right? So we might end up seeing bigger and nastier wars. That's playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah, that's always possible. My personal view is that it does no good to demonize those people. I'm sure that they actually, even if this is totally exactly the way it turned out, I'm sure this was something that they did with patriotic motives, even though other people will look and say that's crazy. But I'm sure that they were actually thinking that what they were doing was for the better. And they deluded themselves into thinking what FDR did with Pearl Harbor would be comparable to what they were doing, and that's how it would be remembered. But the reality is that demonizing them because it didn't turn out that way actually doesn't help the situation. It's anything that ends up polarizing the people so that these are the good guys and those are the bad guys and the bad guys should go out of prison, stuff like that. That actually is self-defeating because there's always more bad guys coming along to replace the ones that you get rid of. Always. It never stops. What really is necessary is a dissolving of the polarization and not to villainize these people. Those people actually were thinking that this was actually going to turn out better for the nation, that Saddam Hussein needed to go, that the oil supplies needed to be controlled. There might have been issues with the World Trade Center also. There's issues with regard to whether the buildings had to come down in the first place due to asbestos content, whether they were damaged in the 1993 bombing that occurred. I mean, there's all types of questions about, you know, sort of extraneous circumstances. But the issue is that demonizing people one way or the other never solves anything because there's always new polarities that will pop up and new people to replace the people that you get rid of. Getting rid of bad guys never gets rid of bad guys. So the only thing that really is useful from my perspective is talking about these remote viewing data as a means of bringing to light what actually happened. But if you'll notice throughout our entire discussion, I never in my mind and never in my tone or with my words changed the topic to start talking about bad guys who were villains who needed to be prosecuted. I never went that way. So that's why. It's a turn the other cheek type of situation, but getting the information out is important. Healing, getting rid of the polarization allows a new type of beginning to occur.
That's fair enough. Hey, all I can say is that this is a really good project that you've done. Your team has done. And as we wrap it up, why don't you tell the listeners again the name of the video and your website and all that?
Yeah, actually a couple things. Of course, you go to the website, which is www.farsight, F-A-R-S-I-G-H-T, like seeingfar.org, because we're a not-profit. But before you do anything, we are a nonprofit and we have no advertising revenue whatsoever. So the only way we can tell people what we do is with our free newsletter. So before you do anything, click on the link at the top of the nav bar and put your email address to let us tell you what happens when we come up with a new project. We typically send a newsletter out once a week, and we never give the email addresses out to anybody, period, full stop. So there's no spam. And so it's our only way of letting people know what we're doing. But right after that, click on the big, huge graphic that's right at the, in the front of you and the homepage of the 9/11 stuff, and you'll go to the page for the 9/11 stuff and watch the trailer. The trailer is really good. The trailer was done by Dick Algar, and he, together with myself, he's a really great videographer also. And get an idea what's there, and then if you want, watch the documentary itself. I can only say that and there's links right on that page to it. And the only thing I can say is that everyone I've talked to who's watched it said it was as riveting as anything they've ever seen. You're watching it live. You're watching it live, remember.
I second that emotion. Okay, Courtney, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
I want to thank you all for inviting me. This is multiple times that you've invited me, and I really honor and treasure the fact that you invite me back.
Well, again, you're doing great work, so we do appreciate it. That's it, folks. Jerry and Melody, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Courtney.
Yeah,
thank you, everybody.
Courtney.
Jerry, Melody,
Till next
thank
time.
you.
That's a wrap.